Have you ever come off the greatest day of your life, and then you realized all of a sudden that the next day you had to deal with some of the fallout that happened from that greatest day in your life, whether that fallout was good or bad to others or whatever? You see, mountaintops, for one person, often becomes valleys for other people. And quite often the mountaintops that put you in a particular position, you then have to catch up with your new situation. And often the mountaintops encroach on the regular duties of daily life, and the duties cannot be ignored. They have to go on, but you've just come off of a mountaintop. Well, such is the case with the nation of Israel after its greatest or great blessing of reaching finally into the promised land after 40 years. Now, I want us to consider, as you may, the particulars after the crossing of the Jordan River among the new pagan neighbors that they were around. The first that we will come about in the text is the concern or the dread of the Amorites and the Canaanites, and we find that in chapter number 5, verse number 1. Now it came about when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel until they had crossed, that their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. We've heard this same fear before in this book of Joshua. You remember when Rahab said the same back in chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. With the camp of Israel in sight of the people of Jericho, it is no wonder the hearts of Rahab's people had melted and their spirits had departed. It was a Canaanite city. The name Jericho is Hebrew, but the Canaanites' name for it was Rahab. It means fragrant. So the Canaanites were all the descendants of Canaan. And Canaan was the grandson of Noah, as we've talked about many times. And when the Lord confounded the language of the people at the Tower of Babel many years before, all the family groups left spread across the world and settled in different areas. Canaan, the grandson of Noah, settled in the land that we know and call today Israel. But prior to becoming the land of Israel, it was known as Canaan land. And some of you know Southern gospel music always talks about we're living in Canaan land, Egypt's behind, crossed over Jordan land, gladness to find. That's one of the lyrics to one of the songs. So Canaan, the grandson of Noah, had children and grandchildren, and some of the descendants of Canaan, their tribes grew and they split off from great-grandpa, and Canaan land then began to be sectioned off with different names for these different tribal little groups, but they're all Canaanites. Let's see, we have the Amorites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, and a few others. And of course we have the original group of the Canaanites that kept the name Canaanite tribes. But they were all Canaanite heritage. So we notice that the writer mentions the kings of the Amorites and the kings of the Canaanites. No one man was king over all the Canaanites. No one man was king over all the Amorites. No one man was king over all the Canaanites. Each Amorite and each Canaanite city or village, they had their own king, but think of those kings more as a mayor of the city. The point in this passage is that the news of the entry of the Israelites into Canaan land did not take long to spread through the whole land, all of Canaan land, all of it. The parting of the waters flatly brought fear to the pagans of Canaan land. Well, another particular that's interesting that Joshua is going to address, and that is there's a problem with the men who are there, and he's got to address the circumcision of the uncircumcised. And we'll see that in verse 2. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make for yourselves flint knives and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time." So Joshua made himself flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Haraloth. Well, before we delve into this verse, we need to address the timing of this most particular subject. It's one of the particulars that have to be handled after you landed and crossed the Jordan River. The nation of Israel crossed that Jordan River and I've got a board up here, okay? And let me explain it. This line right here is 6 a.m. in the morning. This is 6 p.m. and this is midnight. From 6 p.m. to midnight is considered dark or night. So what has happened is at 6 the children of Israel crossed over into the Jordan on the 10th of Nisan. At 6 p.m., after they'd crossed the Jordan River, built the monument at Gilgal and all that, they're going to go into the 11th day. So at 6 p.m. that day, the 11th of Nisan started. There will be daylight hours for the 11th and the 12th and the 13th of Nisan days, and then they have to kill the lamb on the 14th that they selected on the 10th and have Passover in the afternoon or evening. We call it afternoon, they called it evening of the 14th. All right. So now here is where the nation of Israel ran into a huge problem. The instruction for the participants in the celebration of the Passover meal were given back in the book of Exodus, chapter 12, 43 through 48. We need to read that passage for a clear understanding, so let's read that passage. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner is to eat of it, but every man's slave purchased with money, after you have circumcised him, then he may eat of it. A sojourner or a hired servant shall also not eat of it. It is to be eaten in a single house. You are not to bring forth any of the flesh outside the house, nor break any bone of it. All the congregation of Israel are to celebrate this. But if a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it." With that as the background, you still might say, hey, what's the problem here? Well, the writer is going to explain the problem in the following passage. We will pick back up to explain the rest of this verse when we discover the problem. In other words, I've got much to say about the verse we just read, but I'll pick it back up in a couple of verses after we discover the problem. So in verse 4, the writer of this passage discusses those born in Egypt who did not need to be circumcised. Verse number 4. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them, all the people who came out of Egypt who were males, all the men of war, here it is, died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, that is, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn that he would not let them see the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So while living in Egypt for 430 years, Jacob's descendants practiced the instruction that was given to Abraham for every male to be circumcised. A newborn boy was circumcised on the 8th day after the beginning of life, after being born. For foreigners that came into the camp and became part of the fellowship, their circumcision would occur just as soon as they had converted to the faith. All men and boys who left Egypt with Moses were circumcised as part of that covenant of the faith that was started with Abraham. But all children born in the wilderness during the 40 years had not been circumcised. Passover was coming in 3 days, and those men who were not circumcised could not participate. Think of it this way. Only Joshua and Caleb and all the boys who were under 20 years of age 40 years before could partake in the Passover meal because they had been circumcised. Well, let us look at the census records here to get a little idea of the numbers. At the beginning of the Exodus, the census that we find over in Numbers chapter 2 tells us that there were 603,550 men 20 years of age and upward. All of those but 2 of those men were going to die in the wilderness. They were all circumcised, but they're going to die in the wilderness. All these men were circumcised. All these men died in the wilderness and did not cross the Jordan River. That means that number, by the way, did not include all the boys who were 19 years of age and younger that were circumcised. Neither did it include the Levites. Well, now we're 40 years later, and the census in Numbers chapter 26 tells us that there was 601,730 men 20 years of age and upward. Now, only a part of those men who were once under 20, 40 years ago, now are circumcised now. The rest were not. And all the boys born in the last 40 years were uncircumcised. Neither did it include the Levites. So may we just round the number off at a good number, somewhere there, doing a little kind of fat finger pulling out of the sky. There must have been somewhere maybe under 500,000 men and boys who needed to be circumcised before the Passover. It is a massive project. 500,000, just under 500,000. Maybe it's a little more than 400,000. Who cares? Those are huge numbers. And they're waking up the morning of the 11th, and on the morning of the Passover, they've all got to be circumcised, and they have to be healed enough so they can participate. Well, so the writer tells us of those who were born in the wilderness who need to be circumcised here in verse number 7. Their children whom he raised up in their place, Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not circumcised them along the way. Now, let us circle back to verse 2, and I said we'd explain it a little bit later. Here's that verse 2 again, verse 2 and 3. At the time the Lord said to Joshua, make for yourselves flint knives and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time. So Joshua himself made flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibreth Haraloth. Make for yourselves flint knives. That was the instruction that was given to Abraham. And it's also the instruction that is given to Joshua. Now, flint was used for knives, for arrowheads, for spears, since long before the flood. But yet by this time, copper, bronze knives were available. But they would not do, because the Lord wanted flint knives, knives of stone, to be used. It said, and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time. Now we've got a Hebrew problem here, and I want to explain it. This does not mean that a man or a boy can be circumcised twice, for they cannot. It means to start the practice again because it had been stopped. During the Exodus, it had been stopped. It had been practiced for the first time, and then it had come to an end during the Exodus and during the wilderness journey for 40 years. And all the Lord is saying here is, and with Joshua, is started again the second time and circumcised the sons of Israel at this place. That means that roughly 500,000 maybe, or 400,000 of the men and boys that needed to be circumcised, that did not occur, I can tell you this, in the camp at Gilgal, for that would have made the camp unclean according to the law, and the ones who were already circumcised would not be able to pass it because use the Passover because it'd be unclean. So this procedure on all these men and boys occurred at Gibreth Haraloth. Here is where our lack of Hebrew knowledge fails us, because if we could speak Hebrew, which I wish I could do a better job, we would understand, because of knowing what those words are, the Hebrew name actually says that that place means the hill of the foreskins, because the word hill is in that name and the word foreskins is in that name. It was the place where 500,000 foreskins were thrown in a hill or a heap outside the camp. It is the procedure that had to be completed on the 11th of Nisan to give the men and the boys time to heal just a little bit by the Passover. It's going to happen on the 11th. Because some things we know about what happened at Shechem, by the way, in the town of Shechem, which Jacob had bought land from Shechem's father there, the men would take at least 3 days, or the parts of 3 days, to get to where they could move around after the circumcision. One circumcised here, boom, boom, now they're going to be able to move just a little bit. As the men and boys return to the camp with their families, the name is given to the campsite, and we see this in verse number 8. Now when they had finished circumcising all the nation, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day. Now remember, we have already talked about the name Gilgal, meaning rolling, as in the rolling hills. It was and still is in the rolling hills, but that name has much more meaning than what that means. It is the name Gilgal because in that camp, with the men and boys circumcised, and they were there to heal, the Lord says, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." That is to say that is the true meaning of the name Gilgal. Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. We have mentioned the name many times before in our studies in Joshua, and you've heard it said back in the studies of Deuteronomy, because it was foretold to us that that's where we were going to go, even though the campsite did not have that name. But that name was given to that campsite sometime either on the 11th, the 12th, or the 13th of Nisan, boom, 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 right after the crossing of the Jordan River and right after the circumcision of the men. Okay. It's rolled away because they had stopped keeping the covenant that was made with Abraham concerning the circumcision. Now the writer gives us the particulars of the Passover in the Promised Land as we come up here into verse number 10. While the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, they observed the Passover on the evening of the 14th of the month on the desert plains of Jericho. The evening of the 14th day of the month does not mean the night. It means the afternoon. So I've got another little chart here I want to show you. It's a circle, it's the day. Right over here is 6 a.m., that starts with morning. Goes to high noon, and then it starts evening. Goes to 6 p.m., it starts night. Night comes around to morning, and the whole process goes all over again. So, here's the deal. Night follows until 6 a.m. When we start the new day at 6 p.m., it follows, and night follows until 6 a.m. when morning begins. Morning will last until high noon, when the sun reaches its peak in the top of the skies, and as it begins to descend in the Jewish language, that becomes what is called the evening. And it is descending in evening until 6 p.m. when it becomes night right there and goes back around. Evening will end about 6 p.m. with the setting of the sun, and then a new day begins when the dark of the night occurs. What they called evening, we call afternoon. Well, this verse tells us that the nation celebrated the Passover on the same day as they did in Egypt, right here. 14th, that was the day. That's when the Passover happened, on the 14th. The meal was done on the 14th. The passing to kill all those the firstborn without the blood happened on the dark of the 15th. That's where it was. The Lord changed this date, though, back in Deuteronomy. In fact, here's the interesting thing. Back in Deuteronomy, in the last instruction to Moses, in Deuteronomy 16, verses 6, it says, talking about going into the new promised land, you shall sacrifice the Passover in the evening at sunset, catch this, at the time that you came out of Egypt. Well, the nation of Israel left Egypt at sunset on the 15th. Another day I needed here. It'd be the 15th out here. Just as right about here on sunset on a new day, if I'd gone on down and added another one, says you cannot eat I want you to sacrifice that Passover. Do the sacrifice not here in the morning, but I want you to do it at the time that you left Egypt, which was to be about 30 minutes before the sun went down on the 15th. I've always showed it to you in a previous lesson. You cannot eat a Passover meal on the 14th. That the lamb is not slain until basically sunset on the 15th. The thing's not dead yet. So for whatever reason, and we do not know, in Gilgal on that first time out, they celebrated the Passover just as they had done for the last 39 years in the wilderness. And in Gilgal, the 40th Passover of them being out of Egypt occurred in Gilgal, just as it had for the previous 39 Passovers. However, the next year, if they're going to switch it to the Mosaic, what Moses had said for them to do, they're going to switch it to the 15th of Nisan, and that will continue to this day in Jewish life. By the way, that is the main reason of this confusion that many misinterpret the timing of the Lord's crucifixion and the day of the Passover. Now, we dealt with that in our studies over in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you can go grab those passages at my study on that in the notes over at jimhastings.org, and go to each of those books and go down to the passages that deal with that. Now, from the 10th of Nisan until the 14th of Nisan, okay, all was the same as it was for the last 39 years, really 40 years. The Lord provided all the food for the people. They didn't have to worry about anything. However, the food for the day of the Passover in Gilgal is different. Verse number 11. And on the day after the Passover, on the very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. So, just as the Lord had promised in the Promised Land, the food would be bountiful. The day after the Passover, the people gathered manna as they had for 40 years. But they also gathered some food from the land, which supplemented their meals. Well, because the food was plentiful in the land of Israel and in the Promised Land, the manna stopped 2 days after the Passover for the very first time here in verse 12. And it says, the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that year. So the Canaanites had planted the crops, and lo and behold, the Israelites are going to eat it, just as was prophesied in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 10 through 11. So after the manna stopped on the 16th of Nisan, Joshua meets the captain of the Lord for the very first time. Joshua sees the man in verse 13a. Now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand, and Joshua went to him. So Joshua had served as the attendant of Moses since he was a youth. And yes, he'd climbed the mountain, and yes, Moses had seen this man, and Balaam had seen this man because a donkey told him about it, but we're not sure whether Joshua ever had. So Joshua sees the man, and now Joshua questions the man in 13b, and he says, and he said to him, "Are you for us, or are you our adversaries?" Well, with the sword drawn, the man appeared to Joshua to be in a warlike position, and bravely Joshua questioned the man and he said, "Are you on the Canaanite side, or are you on the side of Israel?" So Joshua meets the man in 14a, and he says, "No, rather I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord." Now I want you to remember, the Lord promised the nation of Israel that He would fight for them. And He fought for Moses, and He's going to fight for Joshua also. And also Joshua did what every man should do in the presence of the Lord. Joshua bowed to the man, verse 14b. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" And here Joshua hears the man, here in verse 15. And he says, the captain of the Lord's host says to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. The Lord said the same thing to Moses at the burning bush. Sinai was holy ground. And now the Lord has them in the promised land, and it is holy ground, all of it. I want to tell you, if you meet the Lord, would you jump and shout in all forms of revelry like the people approach the Lord in weekly worships? Or would you fall on your face to the earth and bow down? Would you remove your shoes from the place where you are standing in the presence of the Lord when it is holy ground? Would you take the time from your busy time of worship and the things you do to even notice the presence of the Lord with a sword drawn opposite of you? I think you should. It is what the Lord expects, and He never changes.